Today we are going to ride the lightning, sprinkle some garlic on our carbonara, and take a look at the brethren of the bolt. Welcome to War Games on Toast, all of you lovely people. It's me. It's Toast. How are you this wonderful Wednesday? Last week I ranked every single bespoke warband in WARCRY, and this week I thought I would go back to my roots and do a little bit more guide content, this time focused on some Bladeborne. More specifically, I'm going to go over the Brethren of the Bolt, or Bob from now on, for the Cities of Sigmar Castellite hosts. Those guys are the swanky new humans released late last year. But before we get into all of that jazz, it's time to get a little bit of shilling done. Please consider leaving a like, a comment and subscribing, as that helps me fight against the dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. And if you want to help in a more tangible way, then please consider signing up to my YouTube members or my Patreon, like all of these wonderful people on screen now. Badoosh. You'll get access to some exclusive content, giveaways and outtakes, but with all of that out the way, let's get on with the show.
And now for something completely different.
Normally I start these videos by going through reactions and abilities and then finally ending on units, but this time I'm going to change it up just a little bit because the Bob are a little bit strange. As in, one of their defining features as a Bladeborne warband is that their stats are terrible. So let's have a lightning round. Go. Pater Filius. Expensive, awful in combat, pretty darn durable all things considered. Friar Galvic. Expensive, good in combat and average durability for his cost. Sora Tazat. Expensive, passable in combat, really squishy. Acolyte Arcus. Expensive, ass in combat, made of paper mache. Scorched Yacob. Expensive, even more ass in combat, and also made of paper mache. As you can see, all 5 of these guys are pretty darn bad in terms of value. For the most part, you are paying a lot of points for models that don't really have the stats to justify their cost. Now, the one exception is obviously Friar Galvic, who's actually pretty darn good, all things considered. Now, take all of that information, store it in the back of your mind, because now we're going to go over reactions and abilities, and why the Bob are actually really good. So going on to their reactions, the Bob are all about gathering lightning to damage their enemies and empower themselves, and even to increase their own durability, but being part of the Castellite hosts also unlocks the Castellite wall reaction, giving them 2 reactions per model, and both are kinda cool. I'm going to start with their unique reaction called Ultimate Resistor. In short, you reduce all hit damage in melee by 1, and this does not apply to crits, because hits and crits are not the same thing. And that's it. This reaction is actually pretty okay. Against certain things, it can drastically increase your durability, especially against things with a 2 damage hit profile. This then halves their damage output and makes your guys far harder to kill, and that is always a good thing. If you're running the Bob outside of the Castellite host or outside of a warband with ample opportunities to use certain rune marks, as we'll soon see, this is the only reaction you'll get to do, and it's pretty darn good. Now we get to the real source, the Castellite wall, and this really does amplify the durability and damage output of the Bob by a huge margin. Basically, if you have your guys within 3 inches of any friendly model with the Bulwark rune mark, you gain +1 toughness until the end of the activation. That's important to note because it's not until the end of that attack action you'll have +1 toughness until they are done attacking you with that model. That does mean it stacks, so if you were to react twice, you'd actually gain +2 toughness, and that's pretty good, but again, you do need to be within 3 inches of another model with Bulwark, and spoiler, none of the Bob have the Bulwark rune mark. Still, if you manage to pull this off, all of your guys go between toughness 4 and toughness 5, making them far harder to kill. And then we have the second part. If your models are within 3 inches of something with the elite rune mark, instead you will do 2 damage to the attacking fighter for every miss. And as an aside, both the toughness portion and this portion work against melee and ranged attacks. This is basically counter if counter was twice as good. The downside being none of the Bob have the elite rune mark built in. Oh no. Now the third and final part of this reaction, because it is pretty darn wordy, is that if your guys are within 3 inches of a model with the Bulwark and the elite rune mark, as in one model with both rune marks, you get both effects at the same time. There are very few models that actually have that combination, I am pretty sure there is only one. But if you are next to that one model, the effect is insane because all of your guys get harder to hit and your opponent gets punished for trying to hit you in the first place. Because of these very strict rune mark requirements, one of the best ways to run Bob is actually within the Castellite hosts because they have access to all of the rune marks you could ever possibly need, including the one model who has both the rune marks you need to trigger both effects at once. So it kind of makes sense to run them there, but there are plenty of other warbands that can do one or both of those sides of the reaction if you want to dabble in there too. As a general rule of thumb, most things with big guns are elite, and most things with shields tend to have bulwark, so bear that in mind. But overall, having access to both of these reactions is nothing but a boon and makes the Bob substantially harder to kill than their fairly poor defenses would suggest. Reactions aside though, the real source comes from their abilities, and the Bob have some pretty darn great abilities, as in some of my favourite abilities in a Blade-born warband. As another quick aside, all of the abilities within the Bob can be used by every single model in the Bob, which is kinda cool. We are going to start with their double, and it is called Thunderous Blast, and it is an absolute doozy. Basically, you pick an enemy within 3 inches, roll 3 dice, and then do half dice value damage for every 3+ you roll. As an added bonus, if you have another Bob within 6 inches of you, you can instead measure the 3-inch range from that Bob, letting you extend your range to 9 inches or slightly more because of base sizes. This ability is very cheap to use, does reliable damage, and has a deceptively long range. It is so good, in fact, you will likely dump as many doubles as you possibly can into it to deal catastrophic damage. Considering Friar Galvic is the one Bob who really wants to be in melee combat, he is the perfect target to chain lightning off Thunderous Blast and do massive damage simply by being nearby and doing Thunderous Blast, wait, Thunderous Blast to skyrocket your damage and likely kill most things you're trying to hit. And of course, because you always roll 3 dice and you always hit on a 3+, toughness be damned, you are going to do that damage. Finally, all of your guys move 4 inches, so if you double move 8 inches and then use this, you basically have an 11-inch threat range on your Thunderous Blast just by moving, which will deal more damage than most things just moving once and attacking, and will deal far more damage than your guys just moving once and attacking. This heavily incentivizes most of the Bob to stay safe and stay back and chain off other things that are better in combat, namely Filius and Galvic. Speaking of Galvic, we have a triple designed specifically for him, even though the whole warband can actually use it. It is called Furious Abandon, and it is Rampage. It is exactly Rampage. No joke, it is just Rampage on a triple. You move dice value and then you get to attack. Considering Friar Galvic is a 4/4/2/4, 4/5/2/4 with Blessing, he runs in and he can delete things with his big old hammer because that's 12 attacks if you're within range of that Rampage. That's kind of insane, and you can basically guarantee you can get this off every single turn if you really, really want to, turning Friar Galvic specifically into an absolute brawler who can kill anything from heroes to chaff to even some bigger things. So yeah, Furious Abandon is amazing value and you will get incredible mileage out of it. And finally we have their quad, and boy howdy is this one a bit of a dick. It is called Unleashing His Fury, and it is likely to be one of the strongest quads in the whole game in terms of raw damage output. However, it's also one of the hardest to set up, making it very difficult to actually use in a practical sense. Basically, the guy who uses this quad gets to make a bonus attack action, and if you remember from before, every single model in this warband has a ranged attack. It's a bad range attack, but they all have one. Before you roll any dice, you pick another Bob model anywhere on the board as long as you can see it, and they become part of a chain. You then pick another Bob model within 6 inches of the first model you selected, and then do this over and over and over again until you run out of chains. Then you gain +1 attack, +1 strength, +1 damage, and +1 crit for every model in the chain, so that would be +5 if your entire warband is all chained together at once to all of those stats. Basically a 6 attack, strength 6, 6 damage, 7 crit attack. And that's not all, because the actual attack is then measured from the final guy in the chain, allowing you to fire this from anywhere on the board to anywhere on the board if you set it up right for a massive burst of damage. We're talking like an average of like 25, 30-ish damage when you eventually fire this thing off. It is incredible if you can get that maximum chain going. This ability is super fun. It is unbelievably thematic, and it's great to use when you get to use it, but the setup is incredibly hard to pull off. I mean, you should never really plan to have a quad to begin with, so you're not really going to have all your guys all set up ready to go unless you're crazy and have them always in range to go at all times, just for that chance you do get that quad. So yeah, if you can pull it off, it's great, but just bear in mind, as more of your guys die, the weaker this gets as well, so you've got to not only set this up, but also survive long enough to actually get it to fire off. And considering all your guys want to be within 3 inches, or, you know, Friar Galvic wants to be within 1 inch, that can be easier said than done as well. Now, technically, you also gain access to the quad for the Dawn, but for the Dawn is pretty darn naff, so I will not cover this here. So now you know about the thunder, you can smell the stormy funk in the air. It's time to once again go over the units, but within a new light. Pater Filius is your leader and required to be taken if you want to take the Bob, unless you bring the Bob within the Castellite host. Pater Filius is sadly kind of ass. His attack stats are dreadful at 3-3-2-3, but his defensive stats are actually okay at toughness 4 and 25 wounds. He is 150 points though, making him very, very expensive for what you're getting in terms of raw stats. Basically, Pater Filius is a ball of meat, and I personally like to take him whenever I take the Bob, even though he is very expensive, and that is because he is the hardest of the bunch to kill by quite a long way. If you want to keep your Thunderous Blast up, Pater Filius is ideal for that because you have to dedicate a decent amount of attacks to actually kill him. This also makes him a fantastic lightning rod for throwing into combat to bounce thundering blasts off his little trench-coated dome. And finally, his model is awesome. It's just 2 guys in the trench coat. It's beautiful. Now, we've already sung the praises of Friar Galvic, but my god, Friar Galvic is absolutely worth the praise. This guy's actually great. He is pivotal to how the Bob want to work because he is durable enough. He does enough damage in combat. He has Furious Abandon, and he is the ideal lightning rod to bounce thunderous blasts off. The ideal combo here is to use Furious Abandon or just to walk into combat with Friar Galvic, attack 4 to 12 times, and then the thing you've swung at, if it's not dead, you start bouncing lightning off his head and killing everything that's left. It's incredible. He is so reliable, even though he is only strength 4. For 140 points, Friar Galvic can basically swing into anything his points level or above, and can do pretty well against things higher than his points level if he's supported by things like the Castellite Wall, which we'll get on a little bit later on, and of course Thunderous Blast. Now, Friar Galvic is almost certainly going to die because 18 wounds will only take you so far. However, he will go down swinging and should do a fair amount of damage before he eventually bites the bucket. If you have 15 points and you're running these guys, I would almost always put that 15 points into Galvic for +1 strength if you are using blessings, because strength 5 is outstanding on him. He'll be an absolute chaff blender, and it is wonderful. Sora Tazat is up next, and Sora Tazat is one of my favourite in terms of his actual damage profile, because 5-3-2-3 is really, really fun. Sora Tazat's quite expensive at 105 points, and he's quite fragile at toughness 3 and 12 wounds, but having that many attacks with an okay damage profile despite the low strength means he's actually quite good at doing chip damage and just blending things and hoping the dice go your way. The biggest downside is that with 5 attacks and a low strength, he will likely be countered to death in most games, so bear that in mind. You could go a little bit crazy and give him +1 strength, but that would bring him to 120 points, so I would maybe give that a skip. And finally, because Sora Tazat is the most expensive of the chaffy bobs, he's likely the one you're going to cut for numbers if you want numbers or some more tricks. For example, if you're running Castellite Host, you could drop Sora Tazat and take a Great Banner, and that banner is far more useful and probably the best way to go. Acolyte Arcus is up next, and he's the sort of like middlingly expensive chaff guy at 95 points, and the only guy with range 2. Now, don't get too excited, this guy is kind of a noodle at 3 attacks, strength 4, 1-3 damage, which is really bad for a model at this points level. He's also only toughness 3 with 10 wounds, which makes him made of paper, and basically a caddy for your Thunderous Blasts. You do not want to get this guy in combat. Maybe get him sort of like safely 2 inches away, swing his weapons and throw out some Thunderous Blasts, but you do not want this guy in combat. He is a liability. And finally, we have Scorch the Cob, who actually might be the best technically, because he is the cheapest and still has access to Thunderous Blast. He's basically just Sora Tazat if Sora Tazat was worse by a fair amount. He has 5 attacks, strength 3, 1-2 damage, toughness 3 and 10 wounds, making him absolutely ass in combat and really easy to kill. He is another Thunderous Blast caddy and the best of the Thunderous Blast caddies, because he is the cheapest. You will always have a Scorched Tazat in your warband if you're running Bob, because he is so easy to slot in. Now, realistically, if you want to ally in the Bob, you could take the whole warband for as low as 570 points, and that's actually a fairly okay addition, because that's 5 models who are all pretty good thanks to their ability kit. Now, if you weren't running Castellite hosts and you wanted to take the warband outside of the Castellite hosts, then taking Peter Filius and Friar Galvic isn't a bad idea, simply because you need to take Peter Filius and he's fairly durable, and Friar Galvic is just good. You can then maybe just take your Cob to bounce some lightning, and then you're good to go as a 3-drop in one deployment group, and that's not a bad drop to have, and it's not too expensive in the grand scheme, and it's something definitely worth checking out. But let's stop beating around the bush and let's get onto some list building. So for all of these lists, we are going to take the Castellite hosts because I think they work best within the Castellite host because they have such an abundant access to the rune marks you need. Plus, there are many abilities within the Castellite host that affect the Bob because the Bob have the right rune marks too. So this list is exactly 1000 points and it is 9 fighters. We have the Free Guild Cavalier Marshal, Peter Filius, Friar Galvic, Sora Tazat, Acolyte Arcus, Scorch the Cob, 2 Free Guild Steel Helms, and a Free Guild Command Corps Mascot Gargolian. At 9 man, this warband is a reasonable size. You have access to your Castellite reaction thanks to all of those Steel Helms. You have a movement 9, toughness 5, wound 26 tank to throw at your enemies, distract, murder chaff, and generally be a pain in the ass to keep your other guys alive and safe. And then of course you have all of your Bobs to provide lightning damage just for kicks. An alternative to this is to go super tanky, but you will lose a fair bit of speed. Basically, you drop the Marshal and take an Ogre Warhulk and then upgrade your Gargolian into a 3rd Steel Helm. This is also 1000 points on the nose, and it is also 9 man. This list is far more durable though. Toughness 6, 35 wounds is nothing to laugh at. The 24-inch range rifle attack on the Hulk is great for chip damage. The strength 6, 3-4 damage profile is actually pretty darn nice in combat, and the ability to increase all of your lads by 2 toughness is wonderful. And then you throw in the fact that the Ogre Warhulk has access to both the Bulwark and the Elite Rune Marks, which lets you use your reaction to its fullest every single time. Basically, your warband goes from toughness 4 all the way to toughness 6, possibly toughness 7, and you are dealing 2 damage on every single miss that tries to hit your warband, which is nothing to scoff at. And then of course, once again, you have all of your Bobs bouncing lightning off things and dealing decent flat damage. This warband has a surprising amount of damage because Thunderous Blast is really good, and it's really hard to shift. In the right mission and the right pack, this can just hold ground and just tank and tank and tank and murder everything with lightning and reactions. It's incredibly fun to use. Now, those 2 lists were pretty darn basic. That was just taking some basic Castellite host stuff with the whole Bob warband. But if you want to get more refined, then don't worry, I have the refinement right here. We have a Fusel Major on Ogre Warhulk, Peter Filius, Friar Galvic, a Free Guild Command Corps Great Herald, Scorch the Cob, a Free Guild Command Corps Whisperblade, and 3 Free Guild Steel Helms. This is 985 points, so if you're running Blessings, slap +1 strength on Friar Galvic and you are good to go. This list is still 9 man. Galvic is far more dangerous, and you drop your more expensive chaff lands to take a banner for mobility and a Whisperblade for some effective crit fishing. You can very easily drop the Warhulk if you prefer, and again replace him with the Cavalier Marshal by not buffing Galvic. You could also downgrade a Steel Helm to a Gargolian or the Whisperblade to a Steel Helm and you'd be good to go. And finally, you could even change one of the Steel Helms into a Surgeon if you really wanted to. This list has loads of abilities and is much harder to use because of that, but That being said, it's also far more effective once you get your hands on it. Basically, I would suggest using list 1 or list 2 when you first start out, and then move on to the more refined list once you understand how this Blade-borne warband really wants to work within the Series of Sigma. Now, of course, you could ally in the bob into any order warband. I just think they work best within the Series of Sigma. So overall, the bob are super cool. They are one of the most thematically wonderful Blade-borne warbands in Warcry right now. Now, sure, they aren't going to make as many waves as Vexmore and his thrice-fall Discord, but what they are going to do is give you a fairly competitive Blade-borne warband who are incredibly fun to use and do burst damage like nothing else. And honestly, mildly competitive but hyper interesting warbands is the gold standard that Blade-borne should be gunning for anyway. As the final bit of praise, I haven't had this much fun running Blade-borne since Ephelim's Pandemonium, who are also fantastic. Check those guys out too. But that's the end of the video. Please leave a comment down below letting me know what you think of this video and if you have any thoughts on the bob themselves and if you have any suggestions for future videos. And of course, if you liked what you saw and what you heard, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Until next time, lads, ladies and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra.
Groovy.
Boy howdy, it's Toast and this is the post-toast credits. As always, a massive shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers, Armor Enthusiast 7, Brioche CT6497, Girth Demon, Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Long Run Hobbies, Lord, Phylax, Sable Saber, Sam, Steve Bean, Tough Tootin' Baby, and Velas. Until next time, ta-ta.